talk to you a bit about why trade is important and what we know about it. So people talk about trade as somebody's taking advantage of us if we have a trade deficit with that country. So the great economist Robert Solow used to say, I have a big trade deficit with my barber. I would use that line. It doesn't work quite as well with me. But if you think about it, there are countries that are going to sell us things that we don't have, and we're going to sell things to other countries that they don't have. So we're all running personal trade deficits with coffee shops, with computer stores, with our landlord, and we run trade surpluses with, well, I'm running a trade surplus right now with you. I run a trade surplus with my students. So it doesn't really make sense to think about sort of these bilateral trade deficits as people taking advantage of other people. And in fact, sort of a basic idea in economics is the advantages of voluntary exchange. And trade deficits don't imply unfair practices. So there's a question, if you accept that notion that we're all running trade deficits with the coffee shop and we're running trade surpluses with the people who hire our services, the question then is, why is international trade different from intranational trade? So the economic historian Charles Kindleberger used to ask this question at the beginning of his international trade courses at MIT. And one answer he got one time was, well, intranational trade is between us, and international trade is between us and them. So that's kind of a interesting way to look at it, thinking about international trade is with the other. But really, conceptually, it shouldn't be any different. So here's a chart of net exports minus imports for the United States over the last 70 or so years. And you see that in the post-World War II area, up until about 1970, there really wasn't much trade. But then, this might look to you like an alarming trend, that net exports, the trade deficit is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, I would suggest this is really not a very good graph. What we should be looking at is contextualizing this, perhaps by looking at net exports relative to GDP. And when you look at that, you see that there was this period of trade surplus up until the mid-70s, and then subsequently, we've had trade deficits, which actually, reached its largest amount before the 2008 crisis, and I'll talk about why that was. Right now, it's sort of back where it was in the mid-90s. Now, one of the things that I always teach in my class is that there are well-posed questions and there are poorly posed questions. So a well-posed question is one where you have sort of a clear cause and effect, what economists will call, asking how an exogenous variable affects an endogenous variable, how a cause affects an outcome. A poorly posed question is one where you're asking how two outcomes affect each other. And a lot of the discussion about trade is a poorly posed question, or offers poorly posed questions, because what they ask is, how does the trade balance affect whatever? But the trade balance and all these other things are jointly determined, and they're all driven by other things as well. So I'd like you to think today about well-posed questions, and I'll pose some of them and try to offer some answers to those. So one thing to note, first off, this is from, if you have an iPhone. So as John mentioned, I started a website called Econofact 8 years ago. And what we do is we have professors from all over the country, and other people as well, write these short memos for us. We work very hard to make them accessible to people without any economics training. We are nonpartisan. We just try to present the insights from the research and teaching of experts to the general audience. Because economists, aren't used to doing that. We're actually often pretty bad at doing that. So we offer a vehicle for them to do that. So this is from an Econofact memo that I wrote. There's a QR code for it about international trade. And there are a number of things to note from this. The first thing I want you to see is that both imports and exports have been rising over time in the United States. So the trade deficit as a percentage of GDP, as you saw, sort of reached its lowest. The deficit was the biggest back then. It's sort of more comparable to levels in the late 90s now. But the key thing here is that we're importing more, but we're also exporting more over time. So the United States is a relatively closed economy. By that I mean that as compared to many other countries in the world, the United States exports and imports relative to its national income isn't that big. But it had been becoming larger, more open over time. So this is an important point. There are three different ways to think about the trade deficit, or the trade balance, I should say. And the important thing is that these are definitions. They're not causal. And you can use these to sort of get at some deeper ideas, but these are just definitions. So the one that's probably most familiar to everybody here is that the trade balance equals exports minus imports. But by just, how many people here have had macroeconomics? Okay, and then for the rest of you, how many people here want to take macroeconomics? The rest of you can raise your hand. So from macroeconomics, like y equals c plus I plus g plus trade balance. So just by that definition, the trade balance equals income minus spending. And so this is an important insight. And the way that I often explain it in class is that all my students are running big trade deficits because their spending is greater than their income. And if they're not, then I'm worried about malnutrition for them because their income is very low. So they're all running big trade deficits. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, for those of you who are taking economics courses, a good answer for almost any economics question is it depends. So with a trade balance, if you're borrowing, like my students are borrowing, it can be a good thing because your future income will be higher. I try to emphasize that to them. And then it'll be easy to pay it off, and you're better off than you would be if you hadn't. But then I use the example, suppose you took your tuition check that you borrowed from the bank, and you went out and bought a Maserati instead, which you can do given the level of tuition these days, and you just drove it around and had a really great time. When the bill comes due for that, then it's very hard to pay it back. So you've made yourself worse off by borrowing in that case. So a trade deficit by itself is neither good nor bad. It depends on what you do with the money. And one of the most striking examples of that is the country of South Korea. In the 1950s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had been ravaged by the war. And then what happened subsequently was that South Korea ran very big trade deficits. They were borrowing from the rest of the world. But they weren't doing it for a consumption boom. They were doing it because they were building up their infrastructure, they were building up their industry. And of course, now you know that South Korea is among the rich countries of the world. Through the sacrifice of its own, generations of people who put off their own consumption, but they couldn't have done it on their own because there just weren't going to be enough domestically generated savings for that. So by borrowing from abroad, they enriched not necessarily their lives, but those of their children and grandchildren. An alternative example is when Argentina had a pegged exchange rate back in the late 70s and early 1980s. I had a professor in graduate school in Argentina, Guillermo Calvo, and he talked about how the ports in Argentina were just stuffed with ships because with the pegged exchange rate, the peso was relatively valuable. People knew it wasn't going to last, so they're buying all the refrigerators and television sets that they could at that time. And then when things, came to a head, it was very hard to pay that money back. So the trade deficit by itself is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on what you're using the borrowing for. Also, by the same sort of definitional procedure, the trade balance equals the savings in a country minus the investment in a country. These aren't theories, these are just definitions. It's like 2 + 2 = 4, as does 3 + 1. And so one thing here is that the savings in a country is both the private savings and the government savings. But the government savings is just a budget surplus of the federal government, or negative, it's a budget deficit, it would be dissavings. So there is also a notion that bigger government budget deficits are associated with trade deficits. And is that the case? Well, what's the stock answer in economics, everybody? It depends, good. So you're getting at least 5 points today for that. And I'll show you evidence that sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not true as well. This got a lot of attention in the early 1980s when the United States was running big budget deficits with the tax cuts in the early 1980s and the increase in defense spending. And at the same time, it was running a big trade deficit as well. It turns out that's not always the case across countries and across time. Now, these are, as I mentioned, definitions, and they don't really, by themselves, stand up to, are not sufficient to be analytical frameworks. But people often use them in that way. For example, this definition makes people think, how competitive are we? Are Ford cars as competitive as Volvos? This definition, income minus spending, is how profligate are we? Are we spending our children's inheritances? And this definition is how thrifty are we? And sometimes another alternative is, well, maybe we're just investing a lot, which would be a good thing. But again, because these are just definitions, you can't really use these to analyze things on their own. So, some common misperceptions sort of following on that. There is this idea that because of this familiar, to those of you who have taken macroeconomics, and you'll see for the rest of you who are going to, the idea is if this number is more negative, then GDP is going to be lower. This has been dubbed the trade deficit drag. And Wilbur Ross and Peter Navarro, in the run-up to the 2016 election, were sort of putting this forward as why trade deficits are bad. They're saying, well, if this is negative, this has to be negative as well. So the only good thing about that argument is it made really good exam questions of why is this wrong. As I mentioned, another idea from this is that because the trade balance equals private savings minus investment, then plus government budget surplus or minus the budget deficit, there's this idea that there would be twin deficits. If the government budget deficit is bigger, the trade deficit should be bigger as well. And again, the response to that is, everybody? Come on, I always wanted to run a revival meeting. And then finally, and this is very topical, if it's competitiveness, and if we're being cheated by foreigners who are putting in place policies so they don't buy what we're trying to sell, then the idea is that tariffs would balance trade. So the idea there is, well, tariffs would reduce imports, so the trade deficit would shrink. So all of these, I would say, are what I termed ill-posed questions. They're the misuse of a definition because a definition does not imply a causal relationship. And in economics, we're all about causal relationships. So, with the trade balance as income minus what economists call absorption, what I called spending, which is spending by households, which is consumption, spending by companies for plant and equipment, investment, and all government spending. When spending is greater than income, you need to borrow. Just as at a personal level, if your spending is greater than your income, you have to borrow. So the United States has been able to borrow from abroad at relatively cheap rates. Dollar assets have been very attractive. The concern now is that the price of borrowing for the United States could be going up. And there are a couple of reasons for that. A lot of them have to do with politics. But investors are becoming sort of more shaky about lending to the United States. One way that you can see that is if you look at what happens to the price of gold. The price of gold, as you may know, is over $4,000 an ounce right now. So any of you have like old gold jewelry that you don't want anymore, it's a good time to melt it down and sell it. Now, so I wrote an Econofact memo with my colleague Charles Collins in March when the price of gold was $3,000 an ounce. And what we were able to show in that was that the price of gold over time could be linked to the purchases by central banks of gold and uncertainty. Gold prices tend to rise when things become more uncertain, when policy is more uncertain because people use it as a hedge. The reason central banks had been holding on more gold is there was a concern about US Treasury bills. The president actually sort of floated this idea that they might charge central banks who are holding Treasury bills a premium for holding Treasury bills. So central banks started to say, well, we could hold gold instead as our international reserve. So this was, an analysis we did in March based on years and years of data. I think it would hold up even more strongly now, given the greater spike in policy uncertainty and the 33% increase in the price of gold since when we posted that. Here's the United States international investment position. And you see both assets and liabilities have been rising, but the net position is getting more and more into deficit. Basically, we're selling more IOUs to the rest of the world, and at some point we have to pay those back. And the question is, how expensive is it going to be to pay those back? The idea of a trade deficit drag, that because of the relationship that national income equals consumption, investment, government spending, and the trade balance, that's just belied by facts. So this is, the green line is GDP, the rate of growth of GDP, and the blue, whoops, I didn't want that to happen. And the blue line is the trade balance over GDP. And I've illustrated here places where there's a negative correlation between the trade balance and GDP. So, for example, after the turn of the century, GDP growth was rising, and the trade deficit was getting bigger. If you want to shrink the trade deficit, what you can do is run a very deep recession. That seems to work pretty well. But of course, that's not what we would want. So this idea that, the trade deficit is a drag, just using that sort of simple, misusing, I would say, that simple definition is a flawed way to think about international trade as well. And then with the twin deficits, this again is, the red line is a federal surplus or deficit, and the blue line is net exports over GDP. So here, the yellow bars, like this one and this one, are periods where there was, in fact, a twin deficit. As the federal budget deficit got bigger, so did the trade deficit, or as it got smaller, so did the trade deficit. But the green areas are periods where it worked in the opposite direction. So again, you have to ask well-posed questions, and asking questions of how two things that are determined by other stuff move together is not a well-posed question. So of course, tariffs have been in the news a lot lately. President Trump has been using tariffs as a tool for, he talks about a range of reasons for it. One is revenue, that we're raising government revenue by taxing imports. Another is that you're restricting imports, and the idea is that that could help contribute to a revival of manufacturing. And then there are these sort of retaliatory things. So first off, with the first two, if you have more restrictions, you're going to have less revenue. So there's an inconsistency with that. You can either have revenue and allow a lot of imports in, so you get the revenue, or you can cut off imports, but then you're not going to get any revenue. So you can't have both of these things at the same time. And then the retaliation, that's for economic reasons, but also, for example, tariffs were imposed on Brazil because of the prosecution of President Bolsonaro for running a coup. So, it's not clear to me that, you want to use tariffs for that kind of foreign policy. And to put this into some context, here are the tariff rates, the average tariff rates over the past 100 years or so. In 1930, tariffs were passed, the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And there's an argument that this helped contribute to the Great Depression. That argument might be overblown. There were a lot of other things that were contributing to the Great Depression at that time. But that notion of sort of higher and higher tariffs hurting the economy took hold. And it wasn't just the United States at that time that was imposing tariffs. Lots of other countries were as well. So in the post-World War II era, there was an effort to reduce tariffs. The so-called Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods is this beautiful resort in New Hampshire where in 1944 they held a conference that set up the post-war international monetary system, and it also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Reconstruction and development at that time was referring to Europe and Japan, but of course the World Bank's mission changed after that. But it also created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. So the lessons of the interwar period were very much on the minds of people at this beautiful resort in the mountains of New Hampshire in 1944. And one of the things that they saw was that tariffs were actually not very good for a country. So they set up this agreement on tariffs and trades, which was an effort to lower tariffs throughout the world. In Europe, there were other efforts on top of that as well, but you see that tariff rates fell throughout. China joins around 2000, and so before this administration, the average tariff rate was under 2%. Now it's really hard to say because it moves around all the time. And it's very different for different places, and it's being imposed for different reasons. But it's certainly, on an average, the highest it's been for 100 years. Economists tend to think that tariffs are not a good idea. And there are a number of reasons for that I'll talk about. But there's an interesting exercise undertaken by the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Well, they'll ask experts, what do you think about the minimum wage? What do you think about automatic government spending rules and things like that? The one topic where there's almost complete unanimity among economists from the left and the right is that tariffs that are broadly imposed are not going to be good for an economy. And virtually every economist every economist, I mean, it's like 98% said strongly agree, and then almost 100% said strongly agree or agree. So, I know that experts have fallen on hard times, but when everybody is saying the same thing and they're coming from different places in the political spectrum, it's probably worth paying attention to that. So the way that tariffs, one way in which the tariffs were imposed now was this sort of idea that you look at the trade deficit, the bilateral trade deficit with the United States relative to imports, and somehow they came up with this. And so, President Trump introduced this, and these were like some of the tariff rates that you have. So Vietnam doesn't import that much from the United States, but we import a lot of clothing and other things from Vietnam. So the tariff rate for Vietnam was 46%. For China, it was 34%. For Malaysia, it was 32%. There are these like islands apparently that are only inhabited by penguins, where there is a very high tariff rate. I don't know what we're importing from penguins, but apparently we're importing something, and penguins aren't buying anything from us. So they have a very high tariff rate. But again, if you think about the fact that, I run a deficit with the bakery down the street and I run a surplus with my students, it doesn't really make sense to think about sort of looking at that deficit with the coffee shop, saying that I'm being unfairly treated by them, and then imposing a tax upon them. There's another really sort of more subtle point. International trade between two countries is very much mismeasured. And the reason is that, for example, when the iPhone 7, it's a little hard to get these data, but these economists did this analysis. The iPhone 7, which is, years ago now, it was recorded as a $225 import from China. The retail price, I guess, was about $500 at that time. But the components of this came from Korea, Japan, Taiwan. The R&D came from the United States. And what economists call the value added from China, where it was assembled, was much smaller than that. And so the actual sort of import from China is the value added in China. Does anybody have a guess? Out of the $225, what was the value added by China? Anybody want to hazard a guess? $10. That's not much, right? That's actually twice as much as what it was. It was $5. So if you're using these bilateral trade figures that are deeply flawed, then, even if that idea was right, the data themselves are not right. So this is another Econofact memo that I wrote with Mark Mellitz, who's at Harvard, and we used the information from these researchers, Johnson and Nogura, and you look at sort of what's the bilateral trade based on value added, and what's the bilateral trade based on published statistics. And for example, for China in 2004, based on published statistics, is like $125 billion deficit. But based on the value added, is more like $80 billion. So it's way off. And the reason is because there's a lot of assembly in China of things that are imported from other countries. Now, it's got to be that for the world as a whole, it actually works out for the aggregate trade. So if there are countries where it's, one is bigger than the other, it must be reversed for other countries as well. So for Japan, it actually, because Japan is sort of exporting things to other countries, and then they're coming to the United States, it works in the opposite direction. Well, what about tariffs actually, if they're exports minus imports is one definition of trade, what about the fact that, well, maybe tariffs will serve to right a trade deficit? So there was an analysis done by people at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, And this is, sort of the result of their analysis. These are tariff rates on this axis, and this is trade balance on this axis. And if you look at the scatter points, there's no relationship. So there's no evidence that tariffs actually help that. And in fact, what can happen is that a lot of imports in the United States are capital goods, are machines and equipment that companies will use. Also, for example, they're inputs to production, like steel. So if you raise tariffs, you're hurting your own companies who are using imported goods. So one of the most influential memos that we've published is by Katie Russ, who's at UC Davis, and Lydia Cox, who's now at the University of Wisconsin. And they looked at, in the first Trump administration, there were tariffs on steel imports. And they asked the question, what's the proportion of jobs that use steel to jobs that make steel? And they came up with this, it was very carefully done analysis. It took them a long time. The ratio is 80-1. In the United States, there are 80 jobs in manufacturing that use steel for every job in a steel plant. Why is that? Well, a lot has to do with automation. So steel plants are very, very highly automated now. You don't have these pictures from the 30s of these brawny guys pouring buckets of molten iron into something. It's all completely automated. Apparently, the only people who are working in steel plants now are custodians and engineers. So this is like a bigger theme. If you think about the decline in manufacturing in the United States, you also see a similar decline in manufacturing in other so-called industrial countries. And so there are a couple of reasons for that. One is trade, but another one is automation. And again, if you see sort of a video of how cars are produced now, going along the assembly line, they're all computer-generated machines that are welding, doing all the welding. It's not people anymore. So automation is an important source for the decline in manufacturing employment. But it also means that manufacturing value added hasn't really declined. You just need fewer workers to make the same number of things these days. So this is from the Financial Times, and this is over a very long horizon, since the beginning of the 19th century. And this green line is agricultural employment. So one of the most striking things that's happened over the last few hundred years is that the proportion of people working in agriculture has declined precipitously. And again, that's automation, right? So we have, initially tractors were replacing ox-drawn things, and then it becomes more and more automated. Manufacturing rose as people came off the farms and went into cities. A lot of them were working in manufacturing. So that rose and sort of hit a peak in the mid-60s. And then manufacturing employment as a share of total employment fell after that. And throughout, services have been rising more and more and more. And that's not true just for the United States. This is Canada, Japan, Italy, US, France, and the UK, Germany, France, and the UK. The red line at the bottom, which I unfortunately covered up, shows the difference between 1970 and 2024 in the share in manufacturing. So here's the US. The decline has been even bigger in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. So it's not just a US thing, it's an industrial country thing. Part of it is trade going, or manufacturing going to other countries. A lot of it also, though, is automation. So what we are seeing right now in North Dakota and other places is that retaliation by countries is really hurting farmers in the United States. And this happened in the first Trump administration as well. You know, the foreign officers in these other countries, they're very smart people, and they know, well, you know, we're not going to sort of put tariffs on things in Massachusetts because President Trump isn't going to win Massachusetts anyway. But if we do it on red states, like soybeans, that's going to hit home. So what happened here was that tariffs on China, there was a retaliation on agricultural goods. And in response, the government spent a lot of money to help support farmers who were being hard hit by that. So this goes back to the question of who, you know, about the revenues. Well, you know, if you're collecting revenues, but then you're compensating people who are hurt by retaliatory tariffs, the net effect isn't very good. And this is a forecast for what's going to happen throughout 2025. Another big issue is who pays for tariffs. So you can think about a tariff as a sales tax. And, you know, as you learn in basic economics, the incidence of the tax, who bears the cost of it, depends upon relative elasticities. So if tariffs are higher, who's paying for that? Well, you know, an assertion was made that the foreign exporters would pay for that by lowering the cost of their goods so they could still sell in this market. That's not what happened. So this is from another Econofact memo by Alberto Cavallo, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, and with another economist, Roberto Rigobon, they started something called the Billion Price Project. This is really clever. So what they did is they developed software that will scrape prices off the web in the United States and in other countries as well. And they literally got like 1 billion prices because they got daily prices on different things and in different categories. They've now made that into a private company. And so he wrote this memo for us, and I interviewed him in my podcast. And in this memo, they show that this is what happened to the prices of goods. And the way that this is broken up is that the yellow line is the imported goods, and you see the prices of imported goods went up. The blue line, the solid blue line, is domestically produced goods, but those that compete with imports. And those prices went up as well. If you look at domestic prices that were not affected, they were sort of stable. So in fact, it's American businesses and American consumers who are paying for the tariffs. So it's like you go into a store and there's a sales tax, and you know they're not going to change the price of of a cup of coffee. I don't know. Is coffee taxed in this state? I want to be really like locally relevant. Is food taxed? Okay, good. So I'm locally relevant. So you pay an extra, whatever, 5 cents for a cup of coffee because of that, and they're not cutting the price. Well, the same thing is happening. But it's actually worse than that if you're thinking about revenues. If there was a national sales tax, everything that was sold in this country, regardless of its origin, would be taxed, and the government could raise revenues. But if you have a tariff, the only things that are taxed are imports, but the price of domestically produced goods will go up as well, but you don't receive any tax revenue for that. Another interesting thing that came out in my discussion with Alberto in the podcast is that what's called the pass-through, when tariffs rise, how much do prices rise, has been very slow. But his guess is that it's going to, increase. There'll be more and more of the tariff rate passed through the prices. And the reason is, I realized very similar to what happened in the 1980s. When the dollar fell in value after 1985, you didn't see the prices of Mercedes-Benz rise a lot. And the reason was the manufacturer and the retailers here were worried that if they raised prices a lot, they would lose a lot of customers, And then if the dollar recovered, then they'd have to reopen all the shuttered dealerships. So they waited. It makes sense to wait in a situation like that, where there's a lot of uncertainty. Well, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty now, so a lot of firms are probably waiting to pass on the prices to see if the tariffs are going to stick or not. And the tariff rates have been very volatile, so we're not seeing as much of a pass-through yet, but that might just increase further. And then who's paying for tariffs? Well, we know that a sales tax is very regressive. That is, proportionally, middle class and poorer people pay more of their income for a sales tax than rich people, simply because they spend more of their income on goods and services. Richer people can save more. So as a sales tax, or something like a sales tax, poorer people are going to be bearing more of the cost of tariffs as well. So that's the term that we give to taxes that are regressive. So tariffs don't only, not raise as much revenue as a sales tax, but they're as regressive as a sales tax. One idea that people had was that if there were tariffs, we would import less. If we imported less, we'd have to buy less foreign currency. If there's a lower demand for foreign currency, then the dollar should strengthen. So I never really bought that idea. But if the dollar strengthened, that means that the cost of foreign goods would go down, so it would offset the effect of a tariff. That hasn't happened. So this is another Econofact memo that I wrote with Charles Collins. And what we looked at is what happens to the value of the dollar when there's greater uncertainty. So the blue line is an index of the value of the dollar, and the red line is an index of uncertainty. And typically what you see is that when the world is more uncertain, people would flock to the dollar and to dollar assets because the dollar was seen as a safe haven. So in 2008, when there was a worldwide crisis that started in the United States, the dollar strengthened, which is really unusual because you'd think that if there was a crisis that started someplace, people would flee that country with their money and the currency should weaken. But then the dollar strengthened. So I did this analysis where we looked at sort of 4 months of data, over the last 25 years or so. There are 2 instances when, as uncertainty spiked, the dollar got weaker. The 2 instances were the first 4 months of Trump's first administration and the first 4 months of Trump's second administration, because people were very concerned about sort of what's going on in the United States at that time. And you may know that, at this time in the year, the dollar has fallen by more than 10% as compared to where it was in early January. So this is exacerbating, not mitigating, the effects of tariffs on the cost of imports. So concluding, some of the takeaways from this is that international trade becomes an easy scapegoat for the ills of an economy, but I would urge you to sort of think more carefully about those issues. The issue about trade and jobs, there probably is some effect, but also automation is a very important thing. So people talk about sort of shutting down trade. People don't talk so much about smashing computers as a way to save manufacturing jobs. Part of the importance of trade is not just imports, but exports as well. And we've seen, you're seeing that now in North Dakota with retaliation and export markets getting hurt by the retaliation. And also the use of imported capital goods and imported inputs can be very important for jobs in different sectors. Something I didn't mention is that if you take a view like for the world as a whole, one of the most striking changes in the world, maybe in all of human history, is that 800 million people were taken out of poverty. 800 million people were taken out of poverty in the last 40 or 50 years. And a lot of that has to do with China and India sort of opening themselves up to world trade. So, if you take a more expansive view of welfare than just a nationalistic view, that's something that you would think about as well. Trade affects not just production, but consumption, what you eat, what you wear, what you drive. And finally, the point I was trying to make is that tariffs are a tax. They distort sort of choices that people make, and it's a very inefficient way to raise revenue. So you hear a lot of things about trade these days, and I hope that this discussion helps you put some of these things in context and think about some of these relationships, perhaps in a somewhat different way than you did before. So thank you very much for your attention.
It's open for questions, and so please repeat the questions from the audience, just reminding you that. Thanks.
Yes.
In a talk, you have mentioned that the employment rate over time in agriculture is declining. Can you mention why is that happening?
Okay, so the question, I'm repeating it for the people who are on Zoom. The question is, why has the employment rate been declining, not for everyone, but for what were called industrial countries? So this is Canada, Japan, Italy, the US, Germany, France, and the UK. So this is the share of workers in manufacturing as compared to agriculture or services. A big part of that has to do with automation, that it doesn't take as many workers to produce the same level of output. Another part has to do with the fact that some manufacturing has moved to other countries. So actually, I come from a town in upstate New York that's called Gloversville. Has anybody read the novelist Richard Russo? Straight Man, Empire Falls. So Richard Russo is actually from the same town as I am, and a lot of his novels are about sort of the deindustrialization of places like Gloversville. My father worked in a tannery, and I remember him coming home one day when I was maybe 8 or 9 in the 60s and said, Brazil is starting to export leather, we're going to be in trouble. So part of it is that, some manufacturing has moved to other countries as well. But again, the point of this is that it's not just the United States where we've seen this decline in the share of manufacturing employment, but it's other countries, other sort of what had been called industrial countries as well. And the sources of that are greater world trade, but I would say even more importantly, more automation. Yes? Sure.
According to you, in agriculture, the employment is getting affected by automation, the jobs are cutting off. But as a whole, according to your point of view, is automation really cutting down the opportunities for employment for us, or it's creating new scope as a whole?
So the question is automation cutting down employment? If you look at the overall unemployment rate, there are people who are sort of saying that, because of machines, everybody's going to be unemployed. So this was like the idea of the Luddites back in the 19th century. But more recently, there are people who sort of made that argument. And President Kennedy, when sort of faced with that argument, said, well, if people are clever enough to make machines, they're clever enough to think of new things to do as well. So just think about sort of the kinds of, well, you're not old enough to think about this, but I am, the kinds of jobs that are available now and the kinds of jobs that are not available now. So when I was a kid, there were television repair shops. And you had these vacuum tubes and televisions, and you'd take your television in and they'd replace the tubes. There aren't those jobs anymore. But there were no computer programming jobs when I was a kid. There are no sort of app development jobs when I was a kid. There are a whole slew of jobs. So if you really thought that automation would destroy jobs, we should see unemployment rates of 30%, not 3%. So there's economies are very dynamic. And, there are always new things. Just think about sort of, again, you might not be old enough to think about that, but I think about sort of, what do I have now that I couldn't have conceived of 30 years ago? And it's just, the world changes and people find different things to do. So there's a very static view that, well, if we no longer make gloves, then nobody will have a job. The unfortunate thing is, in the town that I grew up in, when we moved out in 1974, the population was 25,000. Now the population is 15,000. And I recently went back there, and there's just a lot of poverty there. And the question is, how do you sort of manage these kinds of changes to make people not destitute? And it's not just from trade, but it's also from automation. So you see that a lot in the Midwest. And frankly, the United States doesn't do a very good job of that. Other countries try to do a better job. But we haven't done a very good job of cushioning the effects of a dynamic economy on workers. And it's especially hard, if you're older and it's harder to retrain and so on. Yes?
Can you speak to the credit swap with Argentina and the theory behind that, given that they're one of our biggest competing economies as far as egg products go?
So this is a question about what's going on with Argentina. So President Milei came into Argentina, and he had different policies that he wanted to put in place. Argentina has been plagued by very high inflation multiple times over the last, 70 years or so. And there's some sort of deep reasons for that in Argentina, having to do with the budget deficit, sort of the way that the states are set up and they can pass on their budget deficits to the federal government. So President Milei tried something that was also tried in the 1990s, where you peg the value of the peso to the US dollar, and you hope that inflation will fall sort of to be commensurate to that of the United States. That didn't happen. It didn't happen in the 1990s, and it didn't happen now. In the 1990s, what happened was that the inflation rate fell, but there's like an accumulation of the price differential, that things in Argentina were really expensive, even as the rate of change of prices as the inflation rate fell. So eventually, by the end of the 1990s, there was a collapse of what was called the convertibility plan. Milei tried a very similar thing, and the problem is that, again, inflation was higher, so if you peg to the dollar, you have this accumulation of a price difference. And then having lost, having lost an election and their prospects of, not doing well in the next election, investors are saying, well, we've seen this movie before, we're going to get out as soon as we can. And when people want to take their money out of a country, it becomes very difficult to peg the currency. Basically, there's a run on the central bank, and the central bank runs out of reserves and they can't peg the currency anymore. So what happened was that the United States, stepped in and said that, okay, well, we'll lend you this money so you can help defend your currency. And, the ironic thing, or I'm not sure ironic is the right word, but, the thing that's happening is that Argentina also sells soybeans. China cut off its soybeans imports from the United States. Something like 2.5 million metric tons of soybeans are now going from Argentina to China because they're not coming from the United States. So, we're supporting a country that for our trade, for soybeans, it's an important competitor, but otherwise, it's not like Canada or Mexico. It's not a big trade partner of the United States. So we're supporting a country that is competing with people in North Dakota. And, these kinds of efforts typically don't work out. It's not going to save Malay's pegged exchange rate. And so it's just kind of like good money after bad. Yes?
How are we charging against BRICS in the coming 10 years?
How are we?
Charging against the BRICS.
Oh, against a BRIC country? So the question is, how are we charging against the BRICS? So BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the S is for South Africa. Russia's not doing real great these days. There are real questions about China. It's a little hard to get data on China. Now it's getting harder to get data on the US too, I guess. It's hard to get data on China, but there seems to be a lot of sort of financial time bombs lying around in China. India seems to be doing relatively well. Brazil, is doing okay, I guess. But the idea that this came to light this term was coined by somebody at Goldman Sachs in around 2005 or so. The idea was that these countries are going to come and dominate the world. And, it's not been a smooth path for a lot of them. And South Africa is not doing especially well either. So, the idea that these countries are going to end up representing a large part of the world's GDP is just not happening the way 20 years ago people thought it might.
Okay, so thanks. We're out of time now, but we'll take one more question.
Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. What do you think about America's financial future?
I'm sorry, the what?
What do you think about America's financial future, let's say in 3 years' time?
Wait, whose financial future?
America's.
So I often quote Yogi Berra when I'm asked that. Forecasting is hard, especially about the future. One reason is that a lot of what happens will depend upon politics. And the reason I went into economics is I don't understand politics. So, it really depends on a lot of different things that we don't know what will happen. There's an idea in economics attributed to the Chicago economist Frank Knight, who taught in the middle of the 20th century, and he made the distinction between risk and ambiguity. So risk is like if you flip a coin 10 times, how many times will it comes up heads? And you guess 5 because, you have a lot of experience. Ambiguity is kind of like the unknown unknowns, right? And we don't have a historical experience to help us understand what's going to happen. So we're really in many ways, politically, and because of that, economically, in uncharted waters right now. Tariffs, for example, the attacks on the Federal Reserve are very worrying. The possibility that data can be manipulated by the government. I interviewed for my podcast Erica Groshin in March. She was a former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And back in March, she was warning about this happening. So there's just we're in uncharted waters. And as such, I wouldn't want to make any prediction. I guess I could say, buy a lot of canned food and, prepare your safe rooms. But that sounds a little alarmist, so.
Okay, so let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Klein. Thank you. There's a lot of food out there, and if you have extra questions for Dr. Klein, I'm sure he'll answer them. So thanks again for coming, and I hope to see you next week too.